Hello, welcome to Chapter 8 for Geography 101. And now we're going to talk about another aspect of human geography, and that is uneven development. So, oftentimes during this discussions we've had this semester, I've talked about this idea of developed economies, developing economies, and this ties into standard of living, or basically, or wealth, or money. And as we know in our own experience in Chicago, this varies across Chicago. There are some areas that are wealthy and some areas that are not. And this is the same thing as different parts of the United States and different parts of the world. Okay. So let's use these stats to kind of explore this, right? So let's look at the countries of Cameroon, which is in equatorial Africa, Brazil, and the USA. So gross domestic product, or GDP, is just if you took all the economic activity, all the things that are made, bought, sold, traded, everything, that's your gross domestic product. If you divide it by your population, that's gross domestic product per capita. So in other words, if the United States had $1 trillion worth of gross domestic product divided by our population, and you would get this number, right? So this kind of shows you, just generally speaking, the average level of economic wealth of a country. So you can see that we are the highest here. We're much higher than Brazil and much more higher than Cameroon. And then think about those three sectors of the economy, right? So the first level we talked about, right? Second level and the third level, the tertiary, right? And look at in Cameroon, 70% of the forest is involved in agriculture. Only 17% is involved in services. And look at the US, right? Much different. Less than 1% agriculture, almost 80%. Right? So these are things we've talked about. Right? Brazil's getting closer to us in many ways. But look at this. Life expectancy at birth. Right? So how long can you live on average? How long can you expect to live when you are born? So I was born in 19 blah 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 blah. And at that time, due to health factors and nutrition and healthcare, all the things, I could expect a lifestyle or a lifespan of 79 years. Right? So you can see that the wealthier a country is, right? The wealthier it is, the more it has service jobs versus farming jobs, and we see this correlation. And this is not unique to these three countries, right? And so just think about that, right? There are differences in wealth that reflect in physical characteristics, okay? And so there are global differences. Different countries, different parts of the world have different levels or development of economic activity. And this oftentimes is relatable or visual in living standards. How do people live? Right? Are people living as farmers that growing their food they eat to live and nothing else? Are they working in banks? Do they have access to that? What happens to cause this? Why are there differences? So geography looks at this. Are there geographical advantages that can be turned into economic advantages? Are some countries rich because of where they are and what they have? And this kind of goes back to the idea of determinism, right? In other words, the geography of your country will determine your economic activity. This was explored by Jared Diamond in this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. He won the Pulitzer Prize, and he made the argument that it wasn't the Europeans came to control the world, the British, the French, the Americans, mainly because we had better guns, we had the immunity to the germs that we talked about that the Native Americans didn't have. So we had better immunity, which wiped out the Native Americans. We had the guns, and we had the steel or the better technology. And this was the result of geographical favors that Europe possessed. In other words, where Europe was located gave Europeans the ability to do this. So, in other words, it wasn't that they were doing this because they thought it was good or bad, but this was just their locations determined this. And it sounds like a very convincing argument. Well, if you have a country that has a lot of coal, then maybe you're going to use that coal like England did to heat your houses, and that might drive industrial development. But I think the better answer is geographic probabilism. So a great example is this. When it comes to oil, right? Our world economy runs on oil. If you have a lot of oil, you have a lot of money. So you would think that countries that have a lot of oil would have a lot of money. They could invest and they could build schools and they would have a great country. But two of the world's biggest oil suppliers are Venezuela and Nigeria. And both countries are racked with endemic poverty, corruption. They've been ruled by military dictatorships off and on. In fact, some people say that too much of oil can be a curse, right? Now, there are countries that do have a lot of oil, like Saudi Arabia, which has a very high standard of living for its citizens. It does have a lack of religious freedom, the trade-off with that. Norway has a large amount of oil. They have a very high standard of living. The argument there is that Norway discovered their oil after they had already developed their economy with other aspects. But in other words, if you look at determinism as the reason and not probabilism, you are minimizing human actions. The choices that people make in society, in the way we do things, those have a huge difference. I'll throw out another example. When you look at countries and their economic development, one of the things we look at is their amount of trade. The more trade they have, the more money they can make. Now, if you are a country that does not have a port on the ocean, in other words, if you're surrounded by other countries completely and you don't have a coast, it makes it hard to trade because you've got to trade, you've got to send your goods through another country to trade, and it makes it difficult. And indeed, these countries that are called landlocked, like Bolivia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, do tend to be somewhat poorer. But one of the wealthiest countries in the world is Switzerland, and they are also landlocked. And Switzerland doesn't really have many natural resources to trade, and what they have done is they basically use their human resources. So Switzerland makes its money on banking, which is a service industry. They use their technology, they use their social skills. They make their money on other things. In other words, we need to account for that. Now, one of the first geographers to look at this difference and try to explain it was Rostow. He made this model that basically all countries go through these stages of economic development. They start off as a traditional farming society, and then over time, their economic activity grows, they begin to industrialize, they become a mature economy, and they eventually move from a farming society to what we have today, which is a high mass consumption society. Okay? And that this is the pattern. Now, based off some assumptions that I don't think hold valid. The first one is this, that according to this, it's just a matter of time. All countries will go this way. But some countries never go beyond this, or they're stuck here, or they go here, or they go to 5 and go back. Right? It's not a smooth process. So it isn't inevitable. And the other thing is that these just say that this is a pattern that happens. It goes in this pattern. What if something skips? Right? In other words, it doesn't account for society's actions, human actions, choices made. Okay? So the one model that I'm going to focus on this semester to explain these differences in the wealth of countries is called the core periphery model. In other words, it's this spatial system of connections that all the countries in the world are in. And all countries basically fall into the core, the periphery, and then those in the middle, the southern periphery. Okay? This is a legacy of colonialism and imperialism. In the beginning of the 1700s, as European powers began to expand and colonize and become the basically leaders of the world with their stronger economies and colonial empires, this is the, I guess, the system that is set up. And even though empires are long gone, it's still maintained through other actions. Okay, and the world economy is still a result of this. So here is my example. This map of the world shows all the countries of the world. The ones that are green, or I'm sorry, are purple, are European countries. The countries in green are those countries that at one point in their history were colonized or controlled by Europe. That's a large part of the world, isn't it? Now, there's a few right here like Saudi Arabia and China that were partially controlled. They were never completely controlled, but they were very, very dependent on European actions. And then a few were not controlled directly, but basically did what they were told. So what countries were never colonized or controlled by Europe really strongly? You've got Liberia, Japan, Korea, and Thailand. And that's about it. So think of this pattern, right? And this is a map of the core periphery. The countries in blue are the core. The countries in red are the periphery. And the orange are kind of in the middle. And I'm going to go back. Look at this pattern and look at that pattern. And what do you notice? So think about that. I'm going to go back one more time. Europe, colonies, core, periphery. And you'll start to see this pattern that most of the countries that were colonized at one point are either periphery countries or core countries, or semi-periphery. That the countries that were the colonial masters are the core. Now, the United States, if you remember, we were a British colony for a while, and we've become part of the core. We've moved that way, and Australia too. But for most of the world, right, you can see that relationship. Now, the idea of semi-periphery are countries that were in the edge, the periphery, okay, and have begun to move towards the core. So let me go back before I end this section. And how does this model work? Countries that are in the core are the strong, dominant, mature, developed economies, like the United States. They build or sell high-profit goods, like cars or computers, or they do service industry, which is sold back to the periphery. The periphery supplies the core with cheap labor and raw materials. The semi-periphery is kind of in the middle. So ignore this for now and think about the shirt that I'm wearing. The shirt that I'm wearing was sold to me by a company in the core who decided how it was designed and was sold around the world. The periphery is where they got the cotton. They grew it in Egypt, okay? And it was made in Bangladesh. So it was made by goods and material that was imported or made there and then sent here to the core to be sold in the store. And so you have this basically this process of exploitation. Value is taken from the periphery to the core, and the core keeps the value. Even though they sell other things, they're keeping that value. And this can be seen throughout global history. The empires of the world, the British Empire, the French, the American, took from their colonies goods, services, labor. That's why they wanted colonies. And even though, say for instance, India is no longer part of the British Empire, there is still this pattern of being held. Now some countries have moved. So China, India, Brazil, Mexico, they've begun that movement and they're moving towards the core. They're not quite there, and that's what their semi-periphery is. Okay. All right, we're going to pause right here. What I'm going to do, when we come back, the book talks about different types of economies, and we're going to do kind of a thought exercise in class. So when I come back, take a look in the textbook at these different types of economic actions, different types of economic types. And we're going to talk when I come back about actual real examples about these. So we'll be back after you look at your textbook and have a cup of coffee or a hot cup of tea, and we'll be back in just a little bit.